started, even though Kubernetes was kind of alive, and Googling a couple of hours, I ended up with a couple of links. Basically, the idea is that deployments do not create deployment pods, but instead deployments create replica sets, and then replica sets controller is responsible for creating deployment pods. And in our case, our cluster was almost died because of the lack of the resources, but still, to get into it, you should, I think, know Go just a little bit to be able to read what's happening, and this is clearly an exception in many of the key controllers inside the Kubernetes cluster. So, and super useful thing from my point of view, and if you are to take one thing from this presentation, I really think that it should be that one. So you can create your Docker image with all your favorite tools to diagnose, let's say, network issues, any other issues. And then you just run that Docker image inside your cluster with this command, and voila, you have a terminal access with all your favorite features, so you can see what's going on with that, let's say, why the service is not responding and so on and so forth. And this is especially useful to debug some DNS issues inside Kubernetes. Yeah, choosing the right tools is an easy process, but rewarding. Why it's not easy, I showed you earlier the landscape. And we ended up with, these are the main important things. I mean, obviously not using just them, some others, but these are the most important things. So first of all, we were choosing between Customize and Helm. And I loved Customize because it's super easy, super straightforward. It's basically, you have a template and you have a substitution pattern. And voila, you have something like deployment descriptor for production, for staging, for developers. But we ended up with Helm because it provides even more than that. Packaging, dependency, and so on and so forth. We are using SCaFold from the developer's perspective for its dev loop thing. When you just run it and it starts to watch your microservices, if you change it, something, it automatically deploys it to the Kubernetes. Then Harbor is a thing for storing Docker images and Helm packages. Vault for credentials, Cert Manager for certificates, and finally GitHub Actions for CI/CD. And in Helm, also why it was, in the end we went with Helm, because in IntelliJ again, it's very nice support of Helm. You can see the actual values, so you can evaluate template and see the actual values in the end result. And also in runtime, it just shows you the actual value, automatically fetching it from the values file. And for the SCaFold, as I said, it's very easy. You can describe the sandbox of your application, maybe the whole system or just a part of the system. Then you launch this dev loop thing. So we started to build everything, create Docker images, deploy them to Kubernetes. And then if you change something in the source code, so you don't need to compile nothing basically, you just change the focus, files change it, and then SCaFold starts to rebuild and redeploy everything automatically. So you don't need to think about, just focus on the development process. And from DevOps perspective, it's also a useful thing. So this is how we integrate it with our CI/CD pipeline. It's basically just one line, and in the end, SCaFold deploy, it takes the whole stuff and deploys it to whatever namespace we provided. Okay. And another real cool feature I would like to share with you, because I have experience with those. So maybe I will start with experience first. I worked for like 12 years in Germany in the research facility, and they also were kind of certificate authority, so you gave you certificates. But to get a certificate there, you make a request, then go on foot to a guy, show your ID, and then they issue you a certificate. So now imagine you have like even 5 web-based microservices. How painful it is to do that kind of stuff. And this deployment actually is end-to-end automatization. So we have Rutgers, which is certificate authority in our case. So they deployed this ACME thing, which stands for Automatic Certificate Management Environment, and providing credentials from, let's say, Vault. We obtain certificates automatically, and then with this just one line, Cert Manager cluster issue, we bind everything together, and so our services receive the new certificates, auto redeploy it, and everything works out of the box. And for this, we don't even need to develop our own anything. So it's purely a third-party driven thing, which is awesome. So lesson 6, try with some non-critical, non-continuous tasks. Maybe obvious thing, but still, I think worth to put in here. So we started with actually deploying our GitHub actions into our Kubernetes cluster, because we run a self-hosted environment. Very quickly we found out that the system is not very stable, and that was due to the basically lack of the resources of our initial test Kubernetes clusters. And continuing the previous lesson, but I wanted to highlight this one specifically because, again, previously I worked mainly for like using public open source services, never like self-hosted runners. And self-hosted runners give you almost unlimited possibilities. So you define your own Docker image. For instance, here in this case, we define the Java instance, so we can install whatever Java we want. Of course, we can do that with like this GitHub Actions thing, but that makes your GitHub Actions noisy, because for more or less for everything you need to set up Java, then you need to set up like Maven repository, something else, and here you just put everything in the Docker image, and it spins. You have already everything on board. Very cool. And final lesson, be prepared to invest time and resources into internal learning, because, as I said, Kubernetes is something completely different from what we experienced previously. And I firmly believe that developers must know the basics. Okay, some people say they don't need it, they just code, put it into the repositories, and we fetch everything, containerize, drop into the Kubernetes. But I think the real power comes when everyone at least knows the basics and they can think about, because actually Kubernetes implies some architectural design decisions as well. I would say it's biased to serverless, but still, yeah. And the second point is actually saying that architects must leverage new design principles, for that they need to learn them and understand how it all works in Kubernetes. DevOps must be pretty advanced, because again, it's completely different from, let's say, running OpenStack. And yeah, you have to think about that as well. And yeah, so Kubernetes allows a lot of things. If you want a real benefit from them, you at least have to know about them. So I see like 2 possibilities to solve that issue. One of them would be to invite a third-party training company to do the training for your team. But in our case, we actually developed our own workshop, and I think this might be even more beneficial, because then you can really bind this workshop to the things that are happening in the team and already adjusted to processes you have and so on and so forth. So you will have much more engaged students, so to say. So we had like 3 tracks. First one is more like Docker oriented and how you deal with Docker as a developer. The second one is more about Kubernetes itself. And the third one was about like advanced techniques like debugging inside Kubernetes or things like that. So it was a lot of fun. Everyone took their piece, just went through the track, and eventually finishing this with some rewards points, quite a lot of fun. And probably you will have to repeat that training several times. At this point, I would like to switch to challenges. And again, some of them are still open. So if you can provide any feedback, that would be great. So the first challenge is associated with our coastal distributed data centers, more or less. And in the very beginning, we were struggling between like multi-cluster thing versus cluster federation and a single cluster. Single cluster means that, okay, we have nodes on west, we have nodes on east, and then using internal Kubernetes tools, just trying to, if a request comes to the east, then we try to stick to the east nodes, otherwise to the west. But in the end, due to some circumstances, we had to stay with multi-cluster solution, which is basically using have a dedicated cluster per coast, per data center. Another challenge is data storage. Again, we have these distributed data centers. We want to share data between them, obviously. We went with Ceph. I mean, this is still work in progress, and the storage is provided by San Diego Supercomputer Center team. It's not kind of in our control, but taking into account the nature of our data, which is mainly read-only, we also think to actually have like distributed file system and then local storages to each node, and that put the data into those local storages, and from microservices we are running actually read the data from the local storage, which should increase performance and reliability, hopefully. And another thing was we started with a Nexus repository to store our Docker images and Helm charts, chart packages, but apparently it's not really friendly with Kubernetes, how it's called, role-based accounting something. Yeah, so we switched to Harbor eventually. And next thing was due to our Elastic setup. So as I said, we had a very fancy Elastic setup already in place, and on which we also created a lot of statistics about how our system performs, how it's used by the users, and so on and so forth. So obviously preserving that thing is hell of a challenge, especially in the fact that we used HA proxy and Kubernetes is more kind of Nginx biased, so yeah. And finally, there's like Java specific things. So since we are using Spring Boot, apparently it's not really friendly with being deployed as a subpass of the URL. So something like kubernetes.rcsb.org/app1, it doesn't work. You have to have like app1.kubernetes.rcsb.org. Well, yeah. So currently we have a workaround, just since we do not have much services, we just manually put everything into our DNS tables. And then in ingress, we just specify the specific host to match it to the actual service. But this one has a limitation if we want to go to namespaces. So for instance, we want to have production namespace, staging namespace, and a developer namespace that explodes very quickly. So we have to kind of define this DNS entry for almost everything, which is super annoying. So if you have solutions for that, that would be super awesome to learn about. And conclusions. So even though we had some like painful days and painful experience with it, still it's really cool. It's open a lot of, I mean, migrating to Kubernetes opens a lot of opportunity windows for using things like canary deployments, a lot of other flexibility, fully continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines, very easy to set up, and so on and so forth. So we're really happy we made that step, and that's awesome. I would like to thank our team at rcsbpdb.org. So this Jeremy, Jose, and Henry. It's really a team spirit, so you always feel like you're covered with anything. And also San Diego Supercomputer team, who actually provided us with a cluster and those services, so they did awesome job. So thank you so much. This is more or less mandatory slide because it lists all the fundings and all the group members of our team. And at this point, I would like to thank you for listening. And let's switch to the fun part. So questions, answers, comments.
If you want to raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you for giving the talk here. You mentioned concept maps at the beginning. Did you have a favorite tool that you used to build those or display them?
I'm sorry, favorite tool? Yeah. Oh, sorry. So the question is about favorite tools for the concept maps and things like that. Yes, we are using Miro.
Anybody else have questions?
I'm curious which Kubernetes platform you're using. Are you using like Rancher or OpenShift? Did you evaluate those as part of the process?
I'm sorry, so you're asking whether we evaluated Kubernetes platforms?
Yeah, like what distribution of Kubernetes are you running?
Yeah, as I said, we are not really in the control of that. So it's San Diego Supercomputer guys who actually, but they more, I think they did it more or less from scratch. So just took the raw thing and tried to play with it. Sorry, maybe I missed some information there, but.
Anybody else?
Sorry, I missed most of your talk, but I saw a slide where you said you have multiple Kubernetes clusters. So could you explain when you split your clusters, what defines your logic for creating multi-clusters?
I'm sorry, could you, it was difficult to me to hear. What are you asking?
Do you have one Kubernetes cluster or multiple Kubernetes clusters?
Yeah, so you're basically asking about this challenge we had, like, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so in the end, we ended up with a single cluster per host, per data center. So basically, then we kind of need to duplicate all our, let's say, CI/CD pipelines, everything. So when we deploy, we say, okay, deploy to west, deploy to east.
Thank you.
Hello. As somebody who's looking to put Spring Boot into Kubernetes, can you elaborate a little bit more on the problems you had there?
So you are asking about this one, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's not much to say. When we just started to play with it, Ingress didn't work. So we Googled a little bit and quickly found out that Stack Overflow post, when it says explicitly that Spring Boot is not really a friend of URL path. So again, if you have something like your domain.com/app1, for instance, that won't work with Spring Boot. So Spring Boot requires app1.domain.com. This is kind of limitation. Maybe we could fix it somehow, but yeah, we were too lazy to do that.
I'm going to jump in here a little bit just because I have external knowledge and have worked on the program for the 2 cloud native tracks today, but Ingress has always been a little challenging with Kubernetes because it isn't quite fully standardized. They left options open with different implementations. And there is a talk this afternoon by Susan Wu of Google on a new thing that is just coming out called Gateway API. So it is an attempt to put together a uniform API to accomplish what Ingress has. And if you're getting out there started with something new or maybe have had issues with the existing ingress, that session this afternoon might be really of interest to you. Any other questions here? I'm going to jump in with a question just because I'm curious as to what the hardware you're running looks like. Is it, you know, supercomputers implies these are like super powerful things, maybe not standard, but are they on x86, on ARM, some mixture, and do you have GPUs and AI machine learning accelerators thrown into the mix for what you're trying to manage workloads for here?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Great one. Well, that probably I'm not the right guy to ask that kind of questions. I just can share my feeling because, again, I'm just a part of the San Diego Supercomputer Center. I have a feeling that they also started that kind of process of migration to Kubernetes. Obviously, as a supercomputer center, we have a lot of hardware, like specifically for GPU tasks, for some other computing ideas driven by the scientist community who actually come to us and say, okay, I have such and such computational problem, so to say, to solve, and we say, okay, we will deploy such and such a solution for you so you can use it. And far as I know, they are now going to really move to Kubernetes more and more of those high-performance computing things. So in our case, I believe it's just an ordinary server in some racks, a couple of them, so nothing really
Okay,
that
thank you.
fancy.
Any other questions? I'll throw it out there too. It doesn't just have to be questions. I was chatting with some of you in the audience before, and I know some of you are either on journeys like this with other institutions or maybe are thinking of it. If you've got any comments or observation, maybe we can turn this fully interactive and you can tell us what your interests are or what your observations are if you want to raise your hand and share.
Your challenge around DNS, I was curious what your DNS provider looks like. I've used external DNS in the past, and that is super useful for managing the different.
So we are using NS1 as external DNS, which points to our entry points, and then hopefully Kubernetes will deal with the stuff inside it. But I mean, yeah, to actually achieve that, we had to, provide. So these are inside NS1 entries, and then, we configure ingress this way for Kubernetes to actually be able to point this entry point to a specific service.
Last call, any questions or comments, observations? Okay, well, I appreciate it. The SCaLE conference is all volunteer-driven. We get people like Igor coming here who, don't get paid to give these talks. If you, like I do, think that this was great and appreciate it, could you join me in giving him a round of applause?
Thank you.
Thanks. We've got a full day of tracks in 2 rooms related to cloud native. One of the big values of this is to meet people in the hallways as well. And if you're first time to SCaLE, feel free to chat with me about other things to do. I would definitely encourage you to stick around for some of the social events too, like Saturday evening has dinner, board games, and sometimes some of the best experience I've had over the years are joining in on those kinds of things. The exhibit halls are going to be open this afternoon, and if you're local to the area, sometimes people don't notice this, but on Saturday, we are one of the few conferences that are open to families and children. We have a whole track called Next Generation, which is under 18 speakers, and we have sessions designed to teach kids tech with hands-on experiences. So if you're in the area and you have family locally, keep that in mind, because that's a pretty unique opportunity, unique to this conference. And if you already registered, the kids The kids' registration is totally free. And like I say, they have some really cool workshops. There's even a games night for kids set aside for under 18 plus their parents who accompany them. And there usually have been prizes. I haven't looked at it, but that's going on here. There's a lot of other stuff going on, so look at the schedule and look at that kind of stuff. And thank you for coming.